lots of questions and things, and then not much time left, so this is actually a good, from my viewpoint. He was short and quick. And I'd actually like to follow up on some of the themes that Jeff just mentioned. My center is also going to be involved in the 2049 project, but we actually have quite a few collaborations already underway with colleagues here in China and throughout Asia. So I thought, given a limited time, I'd talk a little bit about the general role of the U.S. and China in global sustainable development. As Jeff mentioned, population is an important, not the only driver of sustainable development. China and the U.S., of course, have essentially stabilized their populations, but the rest of the world is still growing significantly. And as Jeff just mentioned, and also on the previous panel, the main growth and the change, certainly in the U.S. and China, is still urbanization. And as Jeff mentioned, great increase not only in the big megalopolises, but also in small and medium-sized cities that are growing rapidly beyond their normal administrative borders and things. This diagram shows how the nightlights of Beijing have expanded beyond the traditional definition of Beijing as a city. And you can see that all around. I was just at the Olympic Village last night and saw the light show, and I'm sure it's very visible from space now. I'll have to check it out. At one level, the problem of sustainable development is really the local stress or the regional stress on the land, on the ecosystems of a particular area. And for example, this index, the human footprint, which our center developed with the Wildlife Conservation Society, looks primarily at how human occupants, infrastructure has spread out across the planet. And as you can see, both the US and China have relatively high, intense footprint on the planet's surface. And you can also see that in the marine systems around the world, particularly the effect of coastal development on the coastal seas and ocean areas. So that's kind of the local stress and problem of sustainable development. And that's, I could spend the whole time talking about the different issues of environment. This is just two examples. One is air pollution, which of course is a continuing problem, water quality and quantity, as Jeff just mentioned, but also new types of environmental threats and risks, things like emerging infectious diseases, where it's really an intersection of population growth and interactions with ecosystems, especially those that have unusual wildlife populations and so forth. And that's, in this paper from Nature, identified areas where there's a potentially greater risk for emergence of new infectious diseases because of that interaction between people and ecosystems. But as Jeff said, on the global scale, what we're really, one of the big concerns is climate change. This data is a little older, but it shows strikingly the dominance of the US and China in CO2 emissions. Again, the more recent data suggests that China in aggregate has outpaced the US in terms of emissions, but the point is primarily that, first of all, the climate change problem in terms of fossil fuel use and emissions really has to be addressed by the US and China. And this also doesn't really show the interrelationship between the emissions, say, from China, which is really driven partly by global demand for products. And so the emissions are credited to China, but they're really driven by global trade and economic development. And that production consumption cycle we heard a lot about in the earlier panel. So again, I could give a whole talk about climate change and some of the things that are already happening around the world. I'm sure you've read a lot about that already, but certainly this assessment, which was in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, highlights some of the vulnerabilities to climate change. China, again, is considered relatively more vulnerable to climate change for a number of reasons. One, of course, is the potential for sea level rise and more intense coastal storms. People normally think of the U.S. as being particularly vulnerable with places like Florida, but in fact, if you look at the number of people living in the 10-meter low elevation coastal zone in China, it's actually a figure that's quite a bit higher in total of people who are living in low-lying areas of China. So the consequences of climate change, and this is just one potential consequence, are really quite significant for China as well as the rest of the world. And again, the IPCC assessment from 2007 clearly documented the changes in ecological systems, in ice and snow, as a result of observed temperature changes on a regional basis that we've already seen are clear and significant. In fact, we are working with Chinese colleagues here to improve the database in China, which had relatively few long-term observations, but in fact we know that they exist. So that's one of the areas where we have work going on in China. And as I mentioned, in order for the world to see a significant reduction in fossil fuels, of course there are many people and groups looking at this, but oops, that's the wrong button. The fact is that to get down to 1990 levels even, you'd have to really, this is China and this is the US, both countries, without major reductions in emissions in both countries, net reductions in global CO2 just won't happen. So a lot rides on what China and the US does. You heard in the news that both the US and China have just issued new model efficiency standards, for example, but that's really just the very tip of the iceberg, what needs to be done. So Jeff actually highlighted a number of these areas: water, food security, urbanization, poverty reduction, new emerging health problems, both these new diseases that get a lot of attention, but also things like cardiovascular disease. Actually, one of my colleagues here from the Columbia Med School is working with our center on that issue. Hazards in climate, which you'll hear from Dr. Mutter, and disaster management, monitoring and collecting data is an area I'm particularly interested in. Environmental education and awareness is something that Erica Helms will be addressing. I just wanted to mention something that again, China is also, and the US are playing lead roles in the development of global systems to monitor climate change and other changes in the environment. There's an international initiative called the Group on Earth Observations, in which different nations around the world, but China and the US in particular, have been trying to integrate data and make data more openly accessible. And China and Brazil has made their data very accessible, as has the US. So from the viewpoint of the Earth Institute, we strongly believe that China-US cooperation is vital for the Earth Institute. We aren't just a research institute. We work on actual applications and what we call practice, trying to influence policy, trying to get out in the field to help people in villages in Africa or urban areas around the world and so forth. We get involved very much in use of cyber infrastructure and new technology for data and information delivery and use. Of course, a lot of education and training, whether it's technical people or institutional people from developing countries, for students at all levels. And as emphasized by the 2049 project, working on long-term planning with organizations like the National Development Reform Commission. Just to conclude, these collaborations can occur both directly between Chinese and U.S. institutions. They can also occur within a multilateral framework. A few of the first couple are primarily bilateral collaborations. For example, we have a project with Yale University and the Chinese Academy of Environmental Planning to look at environmental performance at the provincial level under the international auspices of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, CODATA, which is an organization I work with, and the Group on Earth Observations. We've been doing quite a few projects that involve Chinese scientists and students. The UN has a new network called the Global Alliance for Enhancing Access to and Application of Scientific Data in Developing Countries. My colleague Liu Chuang from the Institute of Geography here is the lead of that. And we're also hoping to start some new activities through the China Global Center. So thank you for your